Welcome to The Liberated Life. Get ready to free your mind, body, and spirit in business and pleasure. Now here's your host, Robin Quinn Keene.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to The Liberated Life. This is your host, Robin Quinn Keene, and I'm really excited today to have my guest, Crystal Heitzma, with me. She is a parenting coach, and she lives in Canada, and she's got 4 kids that she homeschools, which, as you know, if you've listened to the show for a while, I homeschooled my kids. Crystal, I don't think I mentioned that to you, but I did.
No, you didn't. That's awesome.
Yeah, I did, not all the way and not everybody, but at least the first 3 were up until 9th grade, 7th grade, and 5th grade. And that's when my music and dance studio got huge. Anyway, I think it's great that you homeschool. You help parents with positive parenting concepts, help them manage difficult behavior. And I'd love to dig into that with you today. When we talked before the show, you told me that specifically you're really interested in working with people, with kids who have neurodivergent behaviors.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about that because I didn't know what that term meant when we spoke. And then once you said it, I was like, oh, of course, that makes sense. It's kind of new terminology. Yeah. And I'd love to talk to you about that because there are so many kids that have more challenging behaviors. And as parents, we're very ill-equipped to identify what's going on to start with, and then find a way to parent that feels good to us and works for them.
Yeah, definitely. I love what I do. Yeah. So I'm a life coach. I'm a certified life coach. And what happened was I took my undergraduate degree in psychology years ago. I went back to go get my master's thinking that I would do family therapy. And when I found life coaching, I was like, I kind of figured out that life coaching was really what I always imagined I would do as a therapist. I always imagined that I would help people that are kind of already surviving, but just need like extra help and extra support, especially families. That's what I always wanted to work with. And so once I found life coaching, I was like, I actually think this is what I want to do. I have a mom and a sister that are a therapist, so I know therapy fairly well. And so I ended up transitioning and doing life coaching instead. And I loved my whole certification program was great. And it was very psychology based, but a lot of like practical mindset tools. And as I was learning, I was like, oh, this is awesome, because I would read all these positive parenting books, which positive parenting is becoming a little bit more popular now. I probably learned about it 10 or 12 years ago. But it's more and more experts are kind of writing books on it and jumping on board with it. So I think people are kind of understanding the gist of it now. I always loved it, but I really struggled to actually do it. Like I was naturally fairly impatient or stressed out or burnt out or overwhelmed. And so then I'd read all these books about this lovely parenting style that I wanted to do. And I never felt like I could actually do it. And I always knew that one of my children had some sort of diagnosis, but we hadn't had him diagnosed. And so the term that I mentioned, neurodivergent, that is just the opposite of neurotypical. So, any children with diagnosis. And that's kind of a more common term now that we use is neurotypical or neurodivergent. And so that would just cover anything, ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, ODD, SPD, they're all the letters, right? They all mean different things, anything around that. And it's not just parents with children with diagnosis, but it's even parents with children that just have one or more children that they're really struggling with. So often I'll talk to moms who maybe their children don't have a diagnosis yet or don't have a diagnosis at all, but they have kind of explosive behavior or just really difficult behavior that the parents are really struggling to manage. And so I think positive parenting is great for everybody. I think it's just like the best kind of parenting ever. I love it. But I also feel like it just works even better with neurodivergent children because oftentimes we kind of, treat children like at certain stages and phases, they should move out of things like, well, they shouldn't have tantrums anymore. Well, they shouldn't be exploding anymore. Well, they should do this. They shouldn't do that. And it's our expectations that really lead us to frustration and judgment. And when we show up as a mom in this situation where we're already feeling frustration and judgment because we're like, well, you shouldn't be this way, then we really shift how we show up. And then it kind of shames them or frustrates them, or it kind of just it explodes the whole situation really. So when we can focus on us and shifting our own expectations around our children, regardless of whether or not they're neurodivergent or neurotypical, we can show up instead with a little bit more compassion, a little bit more curiosity. Curiosity is usually my go-to. Like, I wonder why. Okay, I thought that by 12, this child would be able to do this. Clearly, there's something going on. So my mantra is always like, children are doing their best. They're always doing their best. And when we can truly understand that and 100% believe it about our child, it can completely change how we show up with them. And we can logically think that and logically know that, but still in the back of our mind be like, but they probably do know better, but they should be doing better. So that's kind of what I help people do, really. I don't help them with their children's behaviors. I help them with managing their mind around their expectations and perceptions of their children's behavior so that they can show up in that positive parenting way. Or I really think it's natural parenting. I think that once we are working through our own emotions and working through our own mindset, that's just the way that we naturally want to parent, is more compassionate and more loving and more forgiving. And even ourselves, it's more self-compassionate and more self-loving. I don't think that anybody's perfect. And I don't think that anybody's, never going to blow up at their child or always be perfect all the time. I think that imperfection has a lot to do with it. And I think that's another gift we give to our children is having them see that we do make mistakes, but then how we deal with those mistakes and how do we deal with our own emotions and how we deal with our own struggles that we're going through in life. Anyways, that was kind of a long answer to your question, but yeah, I love what I do. I work with couples with children with really explosive behaviors, even ones that are in and out of the hospital or really, really, really struggling. I'll work with either the mom or with the couple. And then I also run a monthly membership for moms. And so that's just a really low cost way to get that emotional and mental support for moms that are struggling kind of in any aspect of their life, but specifically in parenting.
Wow. Yes. And so I know that I mentioned to you, Crystal, that in my music and dance studio, we had many kids come through that were specifically on the spectrum or had ADD. It's funny because, that wasn't that long ago, but people knew exactly. They wouldn't give it a general term, but they'd be like, my child has this, my child has that. They've been diagnosed with this. They'd come in, and often we would get referrals from the local schools for kids that they didn't have language skills yet. So they'd go into an early childhood music and movement class. The thing that I noticed was that for some of them with, extreme sensitivities to touch or sound or any kind of stimulation, the parents had absolutely no idea what to expect, except they always expected more. And they didn't expect that, right? They didn't expect it. So I could see they often just felt at an absolute loss for what to do. And they were embarrassed often by their child's behavior, not knowing and not having the tools to deal with it and understand what it was. And I loved what you said about expectations, right? Because unmet expectations are the source of all kinds of upset.
Yes. That really is where I think it's the key to all frustration really is when either we have an unmet need that we're not needing for ourselves, or we have an unmet expectation that's not happening. And so instead of just like kind of pushing that away and trying to be happy, because that's what I see us often do, right? Is we're like, well, let's just think positively. Let's be happy about the situation. And we don't kind of dig up what's going on and why we're not happy and why it's not working. And so that's what I do. I kind of think of myself as somebody who helps shift people's stories. So, I don't know if you've ever heard, there's this really powerful TED talk about the danger of a single story. It's my favorite ever. And she talks about how only having one story about something really affects how you show up. And so I think about that in my parenting all the time. Like if I have this one story that my child is disrespectful or that they're rude, or that instead of they're struggling, that like they're doing this on purpose, or, that they should be doing better, they could be doing better. It's going to completely change how I then act, because I'm going to feel completely differently if my story is that they're disrespecting me versus my child's struggling. They're having a hard time and there's a reason behind this behavior and they're doing their best. Those are just completely different stories. And so when we can have that story of like, maybe it seems like they're disrespectful and there's obviously something going on behind the scenes here, then we can be a little bit more curious. We can, maybe find something that is going on behind the scenes and help them out instead of showing up in that judgment space.
I also love the concept of curiosity, right? I actually have some things written on my wall in my bedroom that talk about, sit back and observe from a place of neutrality. And when I can get myself to neutral, then I can get interested in, if I'm not in neutral and I'm in a reactive state, I cannot get curious because I'm just busy reacting to whatever triggered me.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I think that curiosity is a little bit easier to get to than compassion. So I think of emotions as kind of like on a spectrum or continuum, right? And if we're really frustrated and really judgmental and really angry, and somebody says, okay, well, feel compassion, feel love for your child. Like it's not something you can easily go to. So I kind of just try to start shifting their story a little bit. So, okay, what do you think could be going on behind here? Do you think your child really is trying to be disrespectful? Do you think that they're consciously trying to do this? And they're like, well, no, but yes, kind of a thing. And so I think that what we do is just help kind of shift their story a little bit and help get them to that curious space. And when they can get to that curious space, I find that there's several common unmet needs. And so what I mean by this is like, there's kind of like 4 areas that I look at. And I look at this with my children and with other kids as well. So if they're really struggling with explosive behavior, maybe they have a diagnosis or they don't, I kind of look at like, okay, well, what's their food like? So are they eating healthy foods? Because food highly affects their behavior. Are they drinking enough water? Are they getting enough connection? That's another one of the main areas. Am I giving them enough me time? Do they feel like they have a good, secure attachment? Another one is screens. Screens hugely, hugely, hugely impact children's behavior, and 100 times more if your child is neurodivergent, and even more if your child's a boy. So if you're listening to this and you have a boy who's under 12 and neurodivergent, screens are like the bane of their existence. It's really a struggle for them. And so screens is something I look at. And then the 4th one is sleep and movement. So that reparative, restorative sleep that we get actually can kind of combat the effects of the screen time or the effects of the foods that we're eating. And so can movement. So having really, having a lot of playtime, a lot of time for them to be outdoors and getting fresh air. They actually do this thing. I love reading books about screens, but one of my favorite books is called Reset Your Child's Brain. And she talks about how they did this study where they did green therapy with the children. So they would, have screens and then they would send them outside, or even just looking at a picture of like mountains and trees would kind of start to negate the negative impact that were happening with the screens. Those are kind of the 4 areas that I can get curious about when I can get, like what you said, into that kind of that investigator mode instead of the judgment mama, like the judgment mama of like, you shouldn't be this way. And I know that we're not consciously choosing those thoughts, but our thoughts really impact how we feel. And when we don't question them, when we just believe anything that pops into our mind, often we have a story that can negatively impact our relationship and really stop us from seeing maybe there is a reason. Maybe this literally is this child's best, no matter how crazy or difficult it seems. And then how can we get them help for this instead of judging them?
It reminds me of a time when I started to figure this out. We were at the park, but we had 3 kids and they were little. And the youngest one, who's quite mellow most of the time, had this massive meltdown. I remember standing back and looking at her and thinking, what in the world just happened? So I started ticking off. I was more amused than I was upset because she's just not volatile, right? And so this was out of character. And I realized she was hungry and she was tired. It was that simple. Gosh, and it's so funny because she's 24 now, and we were just together at Christmas time, and her boyfriend was here, and we were taking a drive somewhere. He said, Annalise is pretty mellow. And I said, yeah, unless she's tired or hungry. And he started laughing. He's like, exactly, right?
Yeah.
So this thing has followed her entire life, which is really quite interesting.
It is really,
but yeah,
it's like us too. We have the same thing, right? We'll go around not really meeting our own needs. And then we're these hungry, starving moms. And we're like, why are we turning into rage monsters? Oh, well, we probably haven't fed ourselves really healthy food today or taken a break.
exactly. And when we're parenting, it takes so much to remember even to do that.
Mhm.
I feel like when you're a mom, we're just super vigilant. We're just constantly on the lookout for our children's needs, paying attention to what they need, diffusing situations, anticipating what is needed next, preparing whatever we're doing, especially when you're homeschooling. I remember that very well. I remember thinking, gosh, I feel like I need to go to the bathroom. When was the last time I actually went to the bathroom today? Right? Like when I woke
Exactly.
up this morning, I'm like, I
Yeah.
really should pee.
Yeah,
Yeah.
all of those,
And
that happens to all of us, right? We're just like, wait a second, I didn't get a good sleep and I haven't fed myself and I haven't been drinking water. And it's interesting because my 4-year-old daughter is exactly like what you said. Like if she wakes up in the morning, she'll like wake up pretty grumpy because she's already so hungry. And sometimes I'm like, what? You just woke up. Why are you so grumpy? And then I'm like, oh yeah, wait, she just needs some food. And like while she's eating, she'll just like relax and be fine. But she's just naturally like that. She really needs food like we all do, right? So it is usually one of those 4 kind of areas that's going on. Obviously, with children that are neurodivergent, emotions are going to be a struggle for them. A lot of times, emotional dysregulation is a struggle. So sometimes all of those needs are met and it still is a struggle. And that's just when we can get help managing our own minds around that situation so that we don't make it more of a struggle for them.
I have a question for you. This is a great
Mhm.
conversation. So much here to what you're talking about. Here's the thing that really kind of has been shocking to me, and it's evolved over time. It didn't just happen overnight, clearly, but it is the screen thing that you're talking about. And I still remember the first time I saw a mom hand a really tiny kid, like in a stroller,
Mhm.
her phone, right? And I was like, what, wait. And the baby was like, maybe 14 months old and
Hmm.
was playing with her mom's phone. I just remember thinking, this can't be good.
Yeah.
This can't be good for kids. This can't be good for their brains. This was a while ago when phones were first, coming out. There wasn't as much to do
Yeah.
on them, but and now we know it's not good for their brains. And yet that is the threat. I'll take away your phone. That is the promise. You can use the
Hmm.
iPad if it's used as consequences
Hmm.
a lot of times, reward and threat, both sides. And I also
Yep.
see parents handing kids a device when they, in fact, when the mom wants or dad wants to be busy, has something else to do. It's like,
Hmm.
here, you go do your thing. I'll go do my thing. We're both on screens. We're not talking to each other. It used to be TVs. Now it's a device of some sort. So I would love to get some tips. I think it'd be really great, Crystal, if you have some on how we turn this around. And you mentioned something like you can balance it by then getting out in nature or moving your
Yeah.
body. Right. So what specifically? I mean, so my grandson is neurodivergent and he totally loves being on his iPad. And
Hmm.
now school is on the computer too, right? So we're logging into Zoom, we're doing all this stuff.
Hmm.
I hate to say it, but he spends a fair amount of time there. I have him taking breaks and doing other things, but it's
Yeah.
habitual. What do you do about that? How do you help kids?
Oh, COVID and screens is a struggle. I honestly don't even have any advice for people that kids have to be on Zoom classes unless can you potentially get them off Zoom classes? Is that a possibility? Because that is how harmful I think that they are for kids that are younger. I know that that's not always an option for everybody. Like sometimes you just have to have them in Zoom classes. And if that was the case, I probably would say no other screens. Like that's more than what their little brains can handle. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do is what's called a screen reset. So you take away screens for 2 to 4 weeks. And this doesn't mean like mom can be on her screens in front of kids that aren't on screens, right? So when we did this initially a few years ago, I just checked my emails like before they woke up and then after they went to bed. And so we did it kind of in the rhythm of our life anyways. We were traveling in an RV for a month around the Maritimes in Canada. So it was kind of perfect timing. I just said, there's no internet anyways. We're not bringing the iPad with us. Like it's fine. So it did work quite well. It doesn't mean they were happy about it or that there wasn't days where they were disappointed, but it was handleable and we spent a lot of times outdoors. And then you actually observe their behavior. So you write down before you start, what are some negative behaviors that I see for a week or two? And what are the top, 2 or 3 struggles that I see my child having? And you actually rank them on a scale of like 1 to 10 or 1 to 100, like how intense and how often this happens. Then you kind of pick those couple of behaviors and then you watch as those decrease or increase as the reset goes on. And then you can kind of decide where they're at the end. And then you implement screens again, but in really, really, really small amounts. So for kids under 12, you'd probably implement them back in like, or neurodivergent children actually as well. You'd probably implement them back in about 15-minute segments once a week. So like a really small amount. And as we started implementing them, I could tell which children were struggling more than the other ones. And their eyes would kind of get glazed and their face would get white and their cheeks would get bright red. And they would get that kind of boredom, like, I don't have anything to do. I don't have to do next. My life is a blah, blah, blah. Like all of that. They would just kind of get that whiny boredomness, which didn't happen at all during screens. Like they would go play on their own for hours. I would never even hear the word, I'm bored, or what should I do? Like I didn't hear that. Anyways, it was eye-opening for me. And again, it really is individual. So like my oldest child at that time was probably 11 or 12. He could handle more than what my younger kids could. And honestly, there's really no reason for younger kids to ever have screens. We think that there is because we think it's easy for us to kind of pass it off to them so they have something to do. But I would just go ahead and read a little bit about screens and kids and even just what the, recommended guidelines are for that, because there's reasons that it's a struggle and there's still more and more studies coming out now. It's still fairly new, like screens in general are new, right? iPads and video games and all these things that we have are shifting so quickly that the studies aren't keeping up pace with it. I would guess in, a decade, we'll have a lot more knowledge about the damage, but it's so obvious to me through doing this reset and then talking to my own clients when their children have the biggest meltdowns were often around screens, where when they took them away or tried to get them off, whatever is when they would explode, because screens are more and more interactive. So before you would sit on a couch and you would watch TV from far away, that's called passive screen time. Interactive screen time is when you have like a little phone or you have a video game or you're on Minecraft on the computer or you're FaceTiming somebody. Those are a lot more engaging and interactive. And we think that it's helpful when we're like, well, they're doing an educational one. Well, kids that are 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 don't need to do educational apps on an iPad. They can learn several other ways, right? So it's just trying to figure out what works for you and your family, because it is trying to find a healthy balance where you teach healthy screen habits. And so healthy screen habits start with us. Like I usually tell people to do a self audit. How is your screen habits? Do you feel like you're checking your phone 85 times a day? Like, is it hard for you not to be on your phone? And then working on you first, because they will, mimic that behavior. And then setting really good boundaries for them, because lots of times people are like, but all their friends have this. And I totally get that. But do you want their mental and emotional health to be in jeopardy because all of their friends have something that they don't have? That's a personal decision. You get to decide what you want to do for that. But for us, we kind of just decided, like, before the age of 12, parents are kind of the ones that help their children regulate. They don't necessarily know how to regulate their emotions on their own. And we're there to help them. If your child is neurodivergent, it's going to be much past the age of 12. So screens are just kind of another thing to make it more difficult for them. My kids don't have a ton of screen time. And when they do, I can tell that it affects their behavior. When we're having too much, I can tell that it does. And we'll just do another quick reset. So in the summer, we usually have a fairly screen-free summer. I might have like once a week, we'll do like a movie night together or something, but we don't have YouTube or I don't know, all the other video games and stuff that we used to do. We just don't do that anymore. So it is a tricky balance with education, because even with home learning, there's so much good online. So I do let them have that, but we just kind of balance, okay, how much time have you had doing other things today? Have you gone outside today? Because again, if they're outside playing around for hours, they're going to be able to handle more than if they're just at home all day indoors.
That's really great information, and I appreciate it. I have read lots of different books and different studies on what screen time does, and it's really quite disturbing. So if you're very curious about it, just start looking at the research. And, like you said, Crystal, we are the directors of our kids' lives when they're little. It's really up to us. Our kids can't self-regulate. They don't know what's best for them. They may have preferences, but just because they prefer something, like, really obviously they can't have sweets, at every meal or whatever, just wanted to, we know better for them. We know that they need to brush their teeth. We know certain things. And this is another thing where it's like, okay, great. I know what's best for you is not to be on your device over this amount of time. And I can see it with my little grandson. We can see it with him really clearly, and his mom can tell when he's had too much. And I have another client who, she took the device away, I think it was an iPad, from her daughter, and she just melted down, like had epic meltdowns for like days in a row, which tells you it's an addiction. It becomes an addiction, and kids can get addicted to stuff too.
Yeah, my son smashed his iPad. And when he started our family iPad, and when that started happening, I was like, okay, we need to figure this out. And that's when I started doing a lot more research. And then that's when we did the reset. And now, it's not perfect, but it is getting better. And I do want them to learn those skills. Like, they're going to need to know technology skills, right? So when they're older, like teenagers, I have a 14-year-old son that is fairly neurotypical. I don't know what typical really is anyways, but fairly neurotypical. So what we do with him is I'll just sit and talk to him about it. So what do you think? How do you feel after you've been on screens for hours? What do you think about this? What do you think about that? And I'll actually read him research papers, and I'll actually read him little like clips, or we'll watch a little thing on screens and what it's doing to your brain. And then I kind of let him decide also. I'm not just like, okay, well, 0 screens. Like, that's not realistic either. And then they're not going to learn the healthy habits. You can't learn a healthy habit unless you have the opportunity to do it. So we kind of do that. And then maybe at the end of the week or every 2 weeks, I'll say something like, okay, how do you feel like it's going? Like, how do you feel, about it? And then we can kind of check in with each other. But obviously, I'm not going to do that with my 7-year-old. I actually asked him one time, so how much screen time do you want? Because we were having this conversation with his older brother. And he's like, I want to be able to play Minecraft all day. And when it's night, you guys can go to bed, but I'm going to keep playing. And I was like, well, that's what's going to happen if we let our kids, do whatever they want, because that's how much they want, because it is so interactive that their little brains, it's like what you said, is exactly like taking them to a candy store full of sugar and then being like, okay, have as much as you want, but make a healthy choice, right? They're going to eat until they get sick and can't eat anymore. And that's exactly what will happen with screens. So we just need to make sure that we're taking that responsibility of actually helping them regulate, like you said. And then once they're old enough and we feel like they're old enough, then we can start teaching them those healthy behaviors so that they turn into adults that aren't constantly on their phone. Because I mean, everything that's built within phones, and even the way that phones are built, is built by psychologists that want us to be on our phones and want us to be on apps and want us to be on social media more, right? So we have to actively be fighting against that even as adults. Because even as a mom, like there's some days where I'm like, oh my goodness, I've been on my phone so much today. I've done nothing else. How do I expect my children to, learn this if I can't learn healthy ways of coping with it?
I'll tell you a really quick story, and then I know we need to wrap up. So I had an appointment today, and I was driving home from Seattle, and there was a car that got in front of me at some point, and cute little Honda, and she kept hitting the lines. So the right line, the left line, the right line, the left line. And usually to me, that's like somebody who's drunk or high or something, right? Just can't see where they're going. And then I went, I don't think that's what's going on here. And as soon as she pulled off to exit, I looked, and it was a young girl tucked way down with her phone. She was texting. So not only do we want to teach our kids how to have good habits, but I mean, obviously she's so addicted that she can't even put down her phone to drive, which is exactly what went through my mind. Like, she should pull over. If she really needs to be on her phone for 15 miles, perhaps she should just pull over and handle whatever it is that's so important. And I know that's not really screen time, but it is an addiction. That's what I thought when I looked at her. I thought, oh, she can't even have that phone sit on a seat or sit in her bag. It's got to be in her hands, and she's got to be texting. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, there's a really great book about that called Reclaiming Conversation. And she talks all about how technology is changing the way that we are. And really, it's that we're like, we can't be bored. It's like itchy, right? Like you don't know how to feel it. You don't know how to just sit there and be without any other external input. We're not learning how to do that. And then we're not comfortable with just us. We're not comfortable with just our emotions. We're not comfortable with even sitting and being bored. Even, in the doctor's office, and you sit around and you're in a waiting room, right? And everybody's sitting there. She said something like, if you're reading a magazine or if you're reading a book, people are more prone to interrupt you and ask a question. They don't feel like you're as busy or whatever. But if you're on your phone, they won't. They're just like, oh, they must be busy. They must be working. They must be doing something. And so it even changes how we interact with each other as a culture, as a family, as, with our friends. And I'm not saying that technology is bad, because there's great things that have come with technology, and we use it all of the time in homeschool. I mean, I work with clients online 100% of the time. So we have to figure out a way to use the goodness of it and then also manage it so that we're not just being used by it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you and I could probably talk about this all day long, and probably
Yes.
other things we can talk about. But we are about out of time. So, Crystal, I really appreciated your perspective, and I love the positive but realistic perspective that you have, and helping moms and dads look at themselves and figure out what are those expectations that are contributing to the situation that we have, right? How am I contributing to the situation? And a TED Talk on having more than one way of telling a story about something. And you're right. I look at that just in general with people, especially if I rarely run into anybody who is rude or whatever. But when somebody is, when I was younger, I would think, oh, they're just not a nice person, or they're just really rude or whatever.
Yeah.
And that may not be true at all. It could be a million things. And it's the same thing with our kids. We actually don't know. And especially we don't know when we're upset, what's upsetting them. We need to kind of get back away from it to figure out, like you said, with curiosity and eventually compassion, to really get a sense of what's going on, because we don't know. It could be so many different things.
Exactly.
That was a great point. Well, Crystal, how do people find you?
So I hang out mostly on Instagram, Coaching with Crystal Noel. I do IGTVs and IG lives, and I even do ones where, people will hop on and ask questions and I'll respond to them and whatnot. I love doing that. I also have a blog, so www.coachcrystal.ca. And then I also have a podcast coming, which I'm really excited about, that's going to merge the life coaching tools and techniques that I use on my clients and I use on myself, and then also these positive parenting principles and theories. So I'm super excited for that to come out. It is called the Freedom Moms Podcast, and it will be available on iTunes shortly, hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So you can head over there and subscribe. And as soon as you subscribe, it'll let you know when it's gone live. And yeah, I love working with moms. I have a monthly membership for moms. If you're a mom and you're listening and you're resonating with this, then feel free to connect with me.
Terrific. That's great. Now we know where to find you. And of course, you will know that I'm putting that information in the show notes. So if you want to find Crystal, it'll be really easy. Just look in the show notes and all of the information will be there. We'll add her links to their podcast when we can as well. So you can easily find her. All right, Crystal. Well, thank you so much for being here today. It was really delightful to talk to you. Thanks, everybody, for listening to this edition of The Liberated Life, and we'll see you again soon.
See you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and recommend on Apple Podcasts, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can also get more great information at quittingculture.com.